had laughed too loudly at his jokes, who had cried when the world felt too heavy. She was composed, serene, her eyes glowing with anticipation and love for someone else. He felt his throat constrict. The words he had prepared over countless restless nights, the things he had rehearsed in front of mirrors, in the solitude of hotel rooms after performances, they all vanished. He should have left. Every instinct screamed to leave. To avoid the humiliation, the memory of what could have been, the echoes of laughter and whispered secrets that had once been his. But he couldn't move. His legs betrayed him, rooted to the spot. And then the officiant spoke her name, and it pierced him like a shard of ice. Everything slowed. He noticed the faintest tremble in her hand as she adjusted the bouquet, the soft intake of breath before she turned to face the man waiting at the altar. Every detail was magnified in a way that only his heart could perceive. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look anywhere but her face. The seats, the carpet, the distant window with the rain streaking against it, anything but her. But his eyes betrayed him. And then he heard it. A soft gasp from the crowd, followed by a collective murmur. His pulse spiked. He turned slightly, his hoodie no longer a shield, and there it was. Taehyung, someone whispered, though it didn't need to be said aloud. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had not been invited to stand in this moment. Yet somehow his presence carried a weight invisible but undeniable. And then he spoke. Just one sentence. It was simple, unassuming, yet it carried every fragment of emotion he had buried for years, every regret, every memory, every word unsaid. I hope you're happy. Silence followed. Not a polite pause, not the awkward hush of a crowded room trying to settle. It was a vacuum, an absence that swallowed sound entirely. Heads turned, eyes widened. Some gasped, others whispered in disbelief. The bride froze mid-step. The groom stiffened. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the weight behind them. It was the sincerity, the unadorned truth that only someone who had loved and lost so deeply could convey in such a brief utterance. Taehyung felt the world tilt beneath him. He could see the past and the present collide in her eyes. He saw the shock, the confusion, and then, slowly, the understanding that some things in life cannot be measured by ceremony or timing. Some things linger, and they matter, regardless of the circumstances. The officiant cleared his throat, an attempt to salvage normalcy, but the spell had already been broken. Every eye in the room traced him as if asking, why is he here? What does he want? And he wanted nothing, absolutely nothing. He wanted to witness, to say, to release, and then to vanish. He had come for closure, for truth, for a moment of honesty that could never be rehearsed, and now that it had passed from his lips, he felt lighter and heavier at once. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, to respond, but no words came. Not yet, perhaps never. And he turned, letting the moment hang like mist in the air, and stepped back, retreating toward the shadows from which he had emerged. The crowd murmured, but he no longer listened. He had done what needed to be done. He had said the one thing that mattered, and in doing so, he had freed himself from the past, if only a little. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets glistened wet and reflective under the soft glow of street lamps. He pulled his hoodie tighter, inhaled deeply, and allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't the ending he had imagined, but perhaps it was the beginning of something he had forgotten to allow himself: peace. He walked along the empty streets, the echo of his footsteps mingling with the distant hum of the city. The cool night air brushed against his face, carrying a faint scent of wet asphalt and blooming flowers from nearby gardens. For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the stillness settle in, allowing his thoughts to untangle. The wedding, the one sentence, the way her eyes had met his, it all replayed with a precision that was both painful and oddly soothing. He thought about the years they had shared. The laughter, the arguments, the long nights spent talking about dreams neither of them had fully understood at the time. He remembered the way she had thrown herself into her work with that reckless brilliance, how she had inspired him to push harder, to explore music differently. And now, here she was, stepping into a life with someone else, carrying the weight of a shared past that he could no longer inhabit. Taehyung wandered into a small, dimly lit cafe, a place he had discovered months ago and returned to whenever he needed solitude. He slid into a booth by the window, sipping a bitter coffee as he stared at his reflection in the glass. He barely recognized himself. The man in the mirror had changed. He was still the performer, still the idol, still the man millions adored, but there was a layer now, softened, tempered, aware, that hadn't existed before. His phone buzzed against the table. A message from his manager. "Are you okay? Did you leave the wedding?" He typed back simply. "I'm fine, just walking." He didn't want to explain, couldn't explain the strange mixture of relief and melancholy he felt. He had said what needed to be said, yet it weighed on him like a stone in his chest. Memories of her laughter surfaced again, the way her eyes would light up when she understood something no one else could see. He realized that his sentence, though small, had carried all the care and respect he had ever held for her. Not jealousy, not bitterness, just honesty. For once he hadn't performed for anyone, hadn't curated an image. He had simply spoken, and the reaction had been as intense as he feared, yet fleeting. Hours passed as he remained in the cafe, watching the rain begin again outside. Taehyung allowed himself to feel each moment fully. The ache in his chest, the bittersweet nostalgia, the quiet pride in seeing her move forward. He realized that sometimes, closure didn't come from conversations, apologies, or reconciliations. It came from witnessing someone thrive and being able to accept it without resentment. He glanced at his watch. Midnight was approaching. The streets outside were emptying and the city seemed to exhale with him. A faint smile tugged at his lips. He had done the hard part. He had confronted a piece of his past and it hadn't destroyed him. In fact, it had reminded him of something important. Life moves forward, regardless of what we hold on to. With that thought, he left the cafe, pulling the hood of his jacket over his head. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle, droplets falling like soft percussion on the pavement. Each step he took felt lighter, as if saying the words had lifted a weight he hadn't realized he carried. He wandered through quiet streets, eventually arriving at a small park he frequented when he needed clarity. The moon cast a silver glow over the wet grass, and the benches glistened under the lingering moisture. He sat down, letting the solitude wash over him. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of quiet reassurance. Taehyung thought of the music waiting for him, the new tracks in the studio, the creative projects he had been postponing. For the first time in a long while, he felt ready to immerse himself fully, not to escape, not to perform for others, but to create for the sake of creation itself. He could feel inspiration stirring, a gentle yet persistent reminder that life had not ended with one wedding or one lost love. It was beginning anew, even in the quiet aftermath of heartbreak. He stayed in the park until the rain fully ceased, watching as the city lights reflected off the slick streets. There was a strange beauty in the emptiness, a kind of peace in the quiet moments no one witnessed. And in that silence, he promised himself something. Not to chase her, not to rewrite the past, but to honor the experience, the love that had existed, and the growth it had inspired. For the first time in months, Taehyung allowed himself to feel something beyond the hollow ache of memory. He allowed himself hope, possibility, and the faint, warming realization that perhaps endings were not as permanent as they seemed. They were merely beginnings in disguise. And with that he stood, took a deep breath and began walking again. Not back to the past, not forward to an unknown tomorrow, but simply forward, carrying the weight of what had been and the quiet thrill of what could still be. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds of his apartment, falling in stripes across the wooden floor. Taehyung sat cross-legged on the edge of his bed, phone in hand, staring at the group chat with the other BTS members. The conversation was alive with routine chatter, studio schedules, recording times, a few jokes, but he couldn't respond. His mind was still at the wedding. He replayed every detail. The way she had smiled, the way her eyes had met his, the subtle flicker of recognition when he had spoken. One sentence had been enough to silence everyone, to shift the room in ways he hadn't imagined possible. And yet, it wasn't about the attention. Not for him. It had been about honesty. He set the phone down and leaned back, closing his eyes. Music always helped him process, so he reached for his headphones, letting familiar melodies wash over him. Each note seemed sharper, clearer, resonating in ways that reminded him of the complexity of emotions he had been avoiding. He realized that he had been running, performing, hiding behind his identity as an idol, all while avoiding the simple, uncomfortable truth that people, love, and memories mattered far more than any stage or applause. By midday, he found himself walking aimlessly through the city streets. The rhythm of his steps mirrored the music still playing in his ears, a cadence that grounded him even as his thoughts drifted. He passed familiar cafes, small boutiques, and narrow alleyways, places that had once seemed insignificant but now felt layered with memories. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of impermanence and resilience. The city was alive, pulsing with energy and unpredictability, and he realized painfully that life moved forward whether he chose to follow or not. The wedding had reminded him of the fragility of moments, the fleetingness of opportunities, and the power of words. One sentence, delivered with intention, had shifted more than just his own perspective. It had altered the energy in an entire room. By evening, he returned to the studio, the place that had always felt like a sanctuary. The faint hum of equipment greeted him, the familiar scent of instruments and polished wood grounding him. He sat at the mixing console, fingers hovering over the keys, and began to play. At first, the music was tentative, hesitant, reflecting the uncertainty still lingering in his chest. But as the notes grew, so did his confidence. Each chord, each harmony became a statement, an affirmation of presence and intent. He thought about her again, not with longing or regret but with clarity. She had moved forward, pursuing her life, her happiness, her dreams, and so would he. The realization hit him fully. Closure wasn't about reconciliation or rekindled romance. It was about witnessing, honoring, and ultimately letting go. Hours passed in the studio. The city outside faded into darkness, the only light coming from the soft glow of equipment and the streaks of neon through the windows. Taehyung didn't notice the time. He was lost in creation, letting music carry the weight of his reflections, turning raw emotion into melody. Each note was a fragment of memory, each pause a breath of understanding, each rise and fall a surrender to the moment. When he finally stepped outside, the streets were quiet, washed clean from another night of rain. He walked without direction, allowing his thoughts to drift as freely as the mist curling around street lamps. The city felt both immense and intimate, a reflection of life's unpredictability and the interconnectedness of moments. And then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Not the practiced smile of cameras or fans, but a small, private acknowledgement of what had shifted inside him. One sentence at a wedding had reminded him of what mattered: honesty, presence, and the courage to face what was real. He sent a short text to his closest friends, something simple: "I'm okay. It's different but okay." The replies came quickly, teasing and concerned, but he didn't read them. Not yet. He wanted the stillness, the quiet space to process the aftermath without interruption. As he wandered back to his apartment, Taehyung realized that he had changed in ways subtle but profound. He had confronted his past, acknowledged his feelings, and released the weight he had carried in silence. And though life would continue to challenge him, demand from him, and test him in ways he could not yet imagine, he knew one thing with certainty: he could face it, unguarded and unafraid, because he had spoken his truth. That night he slept with the window slightly open, the gentle drizzle against the pane like a soft reminder that the world was still moving and he was part of it. Tomorrow the music would continue. Tomorrow life would continue. And for the first time in a long time he felt prepared, not because he had all the answers, but because he had allowed himself to feel fully and honestly, and that was enough. The following day, Taehyung arrived at the studio earlier than usual. The city was just stirring to life, the morning light softening the edges of skyscrapers and alleyways alike. He carried a quiet energy with him, a shift that his bandmates immediately noticed. There was a subtle calm in his movements, an attentiveness that hadn't been there before. "Morning tea," Jin greeted, glancing up from his piano. "You okay? You look different." Taehyung smiled faintly, shrugging. "Morning, yeah, just processing." Processing. That word captured it all. The wedding, her eyes, the one sentence that had changed the rhythm of his heart. He didn't need to explain to anyone, not really. And yet, there was a sense of relief in admitting it to himself, even in the quiet of the studio. Jimin approached, coffee in hand, brow furrowed. "I heard what happened at the wedding." Taehyung raised an eyebrow. "You heard?" "Rumors," Jimin said, smirking but not unkindly. "One sentence, that's all it took. People are talking." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. It wasn't about talking. It was about saying what needed to be said. Namjoon wandered over, notebook tucked under his arm. "Sometimes saying less carries more weight than saying everything," he said quietly. "Sounds like you handled it." Taehyung nodded, the memory still vivid. The room, the quiet shock, her expression, the collective stillness. It wasn't about him seeking attention or approval. It was about honesty, closure, and respect. He had done that, and in doing so he had freed himself. The hours in the studio passed quickly. Music flowed through him, notes and rhythms carrying away remnants of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. He noticed things differently now, the subtle harmonies in the backing tracks, the interplay of instruments that previously escaped him. It was as though saying that one sentence had unlocked a new layer of perception. During a short break, Taehyung stepped onto the balcony looking out over the city. The air was crisp, the streets bathed in the pale gold of late afternoon sunlight. He thought again of her, not in longing, not in regret, but in appreciation. She had shaped part of him as he had shaped part of her life, and the acknowledgement of that shared past felt grounding rather than painful. His phone buzzed. It was a message from her. "I saw you there, thank you." It was simple, quiet, but it hit him in ways 1,000 words never could. He typed back after a moment of hesitation, "You deserved every happiness today." The reply came quickly, almost immediately, "I know, and I hope you find yours too." He stared at the screen, a small smile forming. That was it. That was everything. Closure didn't need drama or confrontation. It only needed sincerity, acknowledgement, and mutual respect. He slipped the phone back into his pocket, feeling lighter than he had in months. Later that evening, the members gathered for dinner. The conversation was lively, casual, yet Taehyung found himself quiet, reflective. He observed his friends with a clarity he hadn't noticed before, their gestures, expressions, the unspoken bonds that tied them together. He realized that life continued, and relationships evolved, and sometimes the most important growth came not from holding on but from letting go. As the night deepened, he wandered home alone, streets quiet and nearly empty. The city lights reflected off wet pavement, creating a mirrored mosaic beneath his feet. He walked slowly, taking in the silence, the stillness, and the sense of equilibrium that had settled over him. Back in his apartment, he pulled out his journal. He hadn't written in weeks, distracted by schedules, performances, and the whirlwind of public life. But tonight, he needed to put his thoughts into words, to untangle the emotions that had been catalyzed by one simple act of honesty. "I stood there and said what I needed to say. I didn't expect a response. I didn't want recognition. I just wanted to be truthful to myself and to her. And in doing so, I found peace. Not closure that erases the past, but closure that allows me to move forward. Life is still unfolding, and I'm ready to meet it." He set the pen down, leaning back against the headboard. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, he felt a sense of stillness that wasn't empty. It was full of potential, quiet anticipation, and the knowledge that he had acted with integrity. Outside, the night wind whispered through the streets, carrying the distant laughter of late-night wanderers, the hum of passing cars, and the quiet pulse of a city that never truly sleeps. Taehyung closed his eyes, letting it all seep in, the memories, the lessons, the feelings that had once felt too heavy to bear. He understood now that life wasn't about erasing mistakes or regrets. It was about acknowledging them, learning from them, and moving forward with clarity and intention. He was ready. And tomorrow he would create again, not to escape, not to impress, but to express. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the studio windows, brushing across the polished floors and instruments that gleamed in the early light. Taehyung entered the room with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months, carrying only his notebook, a pen, and the quiet confidence of someone who had faced a storm and emerged unshaken. The events of the wedding still lingered in the corners of his mind, not as a shadow, but as a reminder of how fragile and precious life's pivotal moments could be. He set his notebook on the mixing table and ran his fingers over the keys of the piano. Music had always been his refuge, but today it felt different. Each note resonated with a newfound depth, as if the act of speaking that one sentence had unlocked a reservoir of feeling he hadn't known existed. He played slowly at first, letting each chord linger, savoring the way it felt under his fingers. Then, gradually, the music picked up, weaving into intricate harmonies and rhythms that reflected the complexity of his thoughts. Jungkook arrived shortly after, carrying a bag of snacks and a mischievous grin. "You're up early," he said, tossing a granola bar onto the table. "What's with the serious vibes?" Taehyung smiled faintly. "Just thinking, music, life decisions." Jungkook leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Decisions, huh? You mean that wedding thing?" Taehyung paused, then nodded. "Yeah, it was intense, but also clarifying." The room fell into a comfortable silence. Jungkook, sensing the weight of his words, didn't push. He knew Taehyung well enough to understand that some reflections couldn't be rushed, that some moments demanded patience. The morning passed in a quiet rhythm, broken only by the occasional laughter over a shared memory or a misplaced chord. By afternoon, the other members began filtering in. Jimin, RM, Jin, and Suga all arrived at different intervals, each bringing their energy and warmth. Taehyung felt grounded, anchored by their presence. There was no pretense here, no expectation of perfection, only music, conversation, and camaraderie. V leaned against the piano, watching Taehyung with a curious expression. "You seem different, more present. Did something happen?" Taehyung glanced at him, a small smile playing on his lips. "I said something important yesterday, one sentence, and it changed a lot." Jimin raised an eyebrow, teasing lightly. "Careful, you're starting to sound like one of those motivational quotes on Instagram." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "Maybe, but it feels real." The afternoon shifted seamlessly into evening. The city outside had turned golden, and the studio's warm lights reflected off polished wood and glass. Taehyung worked on melodies, experimented with harmonies, and scribbled lyrics that felt raw, authentic, and unfiltered. Each note, each phrase carried the weight of his experience, his reflections on love, loss, growth, and the courage to face one's past without fear. Later, when the others left to rest or attend other commitments, Taehyung remained, sitting cross-legged on the floor, notebook in hand. He reflected on the past months, the whirlwind of schedules, the pressure of public expectation, the loneliness behind closed doors. He thought about the wedding, about the woman he had once loved, and about the clarity he had gained. Speaking his truth had not only freed her, but it had freed him too. He wrote in his notebook, words spilling out in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Life doesn't wait for perfect timing. It doesn't pause for hesitation. It moves, relentless and unforgiving. And the only way to keep up is to move with it, to speak what needs to be said, to act with honesty, and to embrace the vulnerability that comes with it. Fear will always exist, but courage is not the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite it. As night settled, Taehyung leaned back against the wall, notebook resting on his chest. The studio was silent, save for the distant hum of the city and the soft whir of equipment left on standby. He allowed himself to breathe fully, to feel the quiet ache of reflection and the warmth of understanding that he had faced something difficult and emerged intact. The next day, he returned to the studio with renewed energy. He had meetings with producers and collaborators, sessions planned for new tracks, and the weight of creative expectation, but he felt different. Not lighter necessarily, but steadier, more aware, more aligned with himself. During a break, V wandered over, a playful grin on his face. "You're glowing, T. Honestly, it's noticeable. What changed?" Taehyung smiled faintly, looking out the window at the bustling streets below. "Perspective," he said simply. "One moment, one sentence, it reminded me of what really matters." Jungkook, hovering nearby with a guitar, nodded knowingly. "Yeah, I get it. Some things hit harder than we expect, but they leave us better somehow." By late afternoon, the studio was quiet again. Taehyung sat alone at the piano, letting his hands drift over the keys, experimenting with chords that seemed to capture the complexity of his thoughts. The notes were soft at first, almost hesitant, then gradually grew in confidence, boldness, and clarity. Each chord, each phrase felt like a declaration, not for anyone else but for himself. As night fell, he stepped outside, taking a slow walk through the city streets. The neon lights reflected off wet pavement, the air carried a gentle chill, and the quiet hum of the city seemed to mirror his thoughts. He felt an unusual clarity, a sense of forward momentum, as though every step he took was a step toward understanding, toward creation, toward embracing life as it was. And for the first time in a long while, Taehyung felt entirely himself, free from expectation, free from regret, and free to move forward with honesty, integrity, and courage. The past was no longer a burden. It was a foundation, a lesson, a reminder that sometimes the simplest words, the ones spoken quietly, honestly, and from the heart, could shift the world in ways nothing else could. He paused on a small bridge, looking out over the river, water glinting like molten silver in the moonlight. The city's reflection shimmered, fragmented yet beautiful. He thought again of the wedding, of her, and of that one sentence. And he realized with a calm certainty that life was not about clinging to what had been. It was about honoring what was, embracing what could be, and trusting oneself enough to walk forward unafraid. The wind carried a soft murmur through the trees lining the riverbank. Taehyung inhaled deeply, feeling it fill his lungs, grounding him. He knew there would be more challenges, more choices, more moments that demanded courage and honesty. But he also knew something more important. He was ready. Tonight he would rest. Tomorrow he would create. And in between he would carry the knowledge that life, complex, unpredictable, fleeting, was best faced with an open heart and a voice brave enough to speak what mattered most. The days that followed the wedding were quieter than Taehyung had expected. The world around him continued its endless rhythm, fans, schedules, rehearsals, but within him a stillness had taken root. He moved through the studio with a calm he hadn't known in months, choosing notes carefully, listening more intently, and noticing subtleties he had previously overlooked. Jimin and Jungkook joked about how he had turned into a philosopher overnight, teasing him over lunch one afternoon. Taehyung laughed softly, the sound lighter than it had been in weeks. "Maybe I just realized how little control we actually have," he said, "and how much we can choose to let go." RM, ever observant, leaned back and studied him. "You've changed," he said quietly. "Not in your music, in the way you exist. There's purpose now, intention. Did something happen?" Taehyung hesitated, choosing his words. "It was a personal moment, one that reminded me that honesty can carry more weight than we expect, and sometimes saying the truth, even when it's hard, frees you more than anything else." Namjoon nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Sometimes words weren't necessary. Actions, expressions, and subtle shifts in demeanor spoke louder than any statement could. Taehyung felt that now each step he took, each chord he played, resonated with a clarity born of experience. That evening, as the studio emptied, he lingered, leaning against the balcony railing. The city lights shimmered below like a river of gold and silver. He thought about her, not with longing or regret, but with a quiet appreciation. Their shared past had shaped him, yes, but it no longer confined him. A message appeared on his phone. "Thank you for yesterday. I needed that." He recognized the brevity and sincerity immediately. The wedding, the crowd, the hushed silence that followed his words, it had been impactful for both of them. Taehyung typed back carefully, "You deserved the truth, always." The reply came quickly, "And you deserved peace." He smiled faintly, pocketing the phone. Peace. That word had been elusive for so long, but now it felt attainable, not because the past had been erased, but because it had been acknowledged and honored. The following week, Taehyung poured himself into music like never before. Each session, each rehearsal carried a subtle intensity. His voice held a new texture, layers of emotion interwoven with technical mastery. Every note was deliberate, every movement intentional. He found himself experimenting with harmonies, rhythms, and phrasing that mirrored the complexity of his inner transformation. During a break, V approached, carrying a notebook filled with sketches and lyrics. "You're different," he said again. "Not just calm, there's depth. It's inspiring." Taehyung nodded, glancing at the pages. "I've realized that life isn't about avoiding pain or discomfort. It's about embracing the moments that teach you something, even if they're uncomfortable. Growth often comes disguised as challenge." V smiled, clearly impressed. "Sounds like a lyric in the making." The two spent the afternoon experimenting, the energy between them electric. Taehyung's creativity flowed freely, and for the first time in a long while, it felt entirely unburdened. He wasn't performing for validation or expectation. He was creating because he could, because it mattered to him, and because he understood, finally, what sincerity in art truly meant. Later, alone in the studio, Taehyung replayed footage of previous performances. Watching himself from months and even years ago, he noticed the tension, the weight of external pressure, and the subtle hesitations. Now he observed the same clips with detachment, recognizing growth, resilience, and potential. It was a strange, almost surreal experience to witness your own transformation without judgment, just clarity. He wrote in his journal that night, "Life doesn't give instructions. It doesn't hand out maps or guarantees, but it gives us moments, tiny, fleeting, fragile moments, to act with honesty, integrity, and courage. Yesterday's wedding reminded me that even the simplest actions can have profound consequences. Even one sentence, spoken with sincerity, can change the trajectory of lives. My journey continues, and for the first time, I feel the freedom to move forward without fear." A notification popped up on his phone, messages from fans, expressing love and admiration for his recent performances. He read them silently, a soft smile playing on his lips. Their support mattered, of course, but he realized he no longer created for them alone. He created because the music itself was essential to him, and because living authentically required that he do so. Over the next few days, rehearsals grew intense. The members were experimenting with new sounds, choreography, and arrangements, pushing each other creatively. Taehyung felt invigorated. Each session reminded him of the power of collaboration, of shared energy, and of the importance of presence, being fully there in each moment, for the music, for his friends, and ultimately for himself. One evening, after an exhausting but fulfilling session, he stepped onto the rooftop of the studio. The city sprawled beneath him, lights twinkling like stars, and the night air carried a crisp clarity. He inhaled deeply, feeling the pulse of the city, the rhythm of life itself. He thought of her, of the wedding, of the single sentence that had changed everything. He thought of his bandmates, of his fans, and of the countless small moments that had shaped him. And he understood in a profound, unshakable way that life was neither about regret nor perfection. It was about movement, growth, and embracing the truth, even when it hurt. He whispered softly to himself, a mantra more than a thought. I speak my truth, I live my truth, and I move forward unafraid. A cool breeze swept over the rooftop, carrying with it the faint echoes of music from the city below, the distant laughter of night wanderers, and the quiet assurance of a future yet to be written. Taehyung closed his eyes, letting the moment sink in, feeling the weight of the past lift, replaced by the lightness of clarity and the unyielding pulse of hope.